Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Stevens, and I want to talk about a raisin in the sun with regard to the master narrative. So let's get started. I introduced the concept of the master narrative when we were studying the importance of being earnest. And so now we're going to talk about it with regard to Lorraine Hansberry's Raisin in the Sun. We're going to take the concept a little bit farther. And so let's begin, first of all, with a little review of what we mean by the master narrative. And what I'd like to do is begin with a little bit of a different approach to understanding the master narrative. First of all, think of this particular premise here, that all works of literature represent, that means gives a picture of, okay? That should be give a picture of, all works give, okay? All works give a picture of the culture that produces them, and all works of literature in some way comment on that culture. In other words, the work of literature in this particular view of literature does not exist independently of the culture that produces it. And notice I say the culture that produces it. We're not just talking about the author. Obviously, an author has something to do with producing a work of literature, but that author then is obviously drawing upon the culture to which he or she belongs, right? So, here's what I want you to think about. First of all, master narrative means it is the master's story. Who do we call the masters, or what do we mean by the masters? Okay, the masters are the people in charge in the culture generally. All right? So they are the masters. They are the dominant group, whoever they happen to be. Okay, so it's the master's story. The masters are the people in charge. And the story is told by the masters. They get to tell their own story. Or representative, okay? All right? Or the representative of the master, okay? Now, don't take this too literally. When we say masters, we don't mean the president or the senators or the corporate executives or people like that. We don't mean that they sit down and they have a story that they're going to tell. Okay, that's not what we mean. We don't mean this literally. What we mean is that literature somehow represents the point of view of the dominant group in the culture. The dominant group decides who's going to write the literature. The dominant group decides what's going to be in that literature. The dominant group then decides on the publication of that literature. That literature then represents the point of view of the masters. That is, the dominant group, the people in charge. All right? That's the general idea here. So, we say then that a master narrative is the big story of the culture behind the individual stories. Okay? Individual stories such as the importance of being earnest, or the raisin in the sun, right? The story that the master narrative tells makes the culture legitimate. That is, it justifies the social structure. It basically says that the values and the way society is put together, all of these things are legitimate. They are justified. They are right and good. Master narrative also tells this. Okay, we've already covered this, right? The story told by the masters or the masters' representatives, right? About who the masters are, meaning it's the story of who holds power why they have a right to hold that power. The politics. Okay, now I've mentioned that this is a political view of literature because it basically is it's saying literature in effect, although it might not consciously intend to do this, literature in effect tells the story of the dominant group. It is not interested in telling the story of the subordinate groups, the minorities, the people who don't have the power, and so on. So, in arguing for the underlying values and structure of the culture, the master narrative then is political. This is another point I want you to keep in mind. The values and structure are often taken for granted. Okay, I think a lot of this will become clear as we start to look at Raisin in the Sun. That's the master narrative. Remember that the master narrative is behind. It is invisible. You don't actually see the master narrative itself. What you see is the individual work of literature, and somehow that work of literature is also telling the story of or representing the point of view of the dominant group in society. So when you're looking at an individual work of literature, there are a couple of things that you want to do. You want to look at the who, and you want to look at the what. So you look at who wrote it. Was it written by a member of the dominant culture or not? And then who is speaking in that work? Not just the author, right? But the author is writing about people, writing about a particular culture, writing about things that happen in that culture, and so on, okay? So the work of literature then is also speaking for those people, all right? So who are they speaking for? So it could be the characters in the story are talking. Who do those characters in the play or the story speak for? And is she? Okay, it could be a she or it could be a they. And by the way, I'm using she here because we are dealing with a play that was written by a woman, Lorraine Hansberry. We want to ask, is she speaking for the masters? Or did she somehow manage to write something, okay, and get it published and get it out before the public, something that in fact does not speak for the masters, because that's another possibility, okay? You want to look at who sets the rules for the narrative itself. And I'm talking here not about the master narrative, okay? Remember, the master narrative is simply the general story, okay, the untold or unspoken story of the master class, okay? All right? So, but here we're talking about the individual story, not the master narrative itself. But you want to ask yourself, okay, we're looking at this work of literature from the point of view of the master narrative. So who sets the rules for this particular kind of narrative? All right. So if you're looking at a play by Lorraine Hansberry, then you're looking at a particular genre, right? You're looking at drama, and you're asking yourself, okay, where does this particular kind of literature, this particular kind of drama, where does it come from? Did Lorraine Hansberry invent the form herself? Or is she drawing upon something that perhaps already belongs to the master narrative? So a question here is not simply who wrote it, who is speaking, who is being represented in this work, but we also have to ask, where did the rules for the literature itself come from? Because if those rules came from the dominant culture, even if it's written by somebody who does not belong to that culture, even if it is written about people who don't belong to that culture, and even if it is not necessarily representing the values of that culture, if it is using a literary form that belongs to the master culture, then to at least that extent, it is representing the master narrative, right? Finally, we ask, I suppose this could go, this here could go under the what, couldn't it? Okay, is it a master narrative or is it some way an anti-master narrative? Remember, works of literature not only represent the culture from which they come, but they also comment on it, and very often they can comment negatively on it. All right, so what? When you look at the work of literature, look at who has the power, who is making decisions, who controls the money, how are the resources, housing, food, clothing, all of those things, how are they distributed, who gets them, all right? How are the social groups structured? What are the attitudes toward property represented in the work of literature? These are all, okay, these are all related to the master narrative. Oops, I'm losing my page here. They're all related to the master narrative, right? But they are part of the individual work. So when we look at the master narrative, we look at the story of who has power, how the resources are distributed, and so on. But then when we look at the individual work, we look at the same kinds of things in that work. All right? Finally, what is the big picture of life? What is the master's view of what is the good? What is it that people consider to be good? What are they working for? What are they dreaming about? What is the end of life? What constitutes happiness, and so on? Those big questions. All right. Now you'll see when we start talking about Raisin in the Sun, we're going to apply those questions to Raisin in the Sun, right? And I hope you'll see how this works. So, we're going to ask, who wrote Raisin in the Sun? Very important. So, and what group does she belong to? Okay, so we say, yes, Lorraine Hansberry, okay, but what group? Okay, meaning what social group? And so she is African American, right? Okay, so we take note of that. All right, how does that relate to the master narrative? All right, so Lorraine Hansberry belongs to the group that we call African American. Who is speaking? In the play itself, who is speaking? And okay, I'm just going to suggest an answer here. There are different possible answers, but certainly one obvious answer is that, among others, one group that is speaking is the African Americans, right? They are the dominant voice in the play, all right? So who are they speaking for? Who do they represent? Now you might say, well, that's obvious. These people are African Americans, so they must be speaking for African Americans. Not necessarily, because the question is, what values, okay, beliefs, okay, what good, that is, what sense of the good do they speak for? Okay, are they speaking for African American values, or are they, perhaps without knowing it, representing values of a larger group, not just African Americans, but maybe a larger group, or perhaps unconsciously they might even be representing values that they might not consciously hold themselves. big question here, okay? Is she Lorraine Hansberry, or are they speaking for the masters? And then who sets the rules for that narrative? Okay, getting back to the question of genre here, which is drama, which is a particular kind of drama. And as you know, there are certain rules that underlie any kind of work of literature. We've looked at those rules throughout the course, haven't we? So, what kind of play is it that Lorraine Hansberry is writing? Is she inventing a completely new play? Is she drawing upon a fairly traditional kind of drama? And so on. Important questions to answer. And then finally, is it a master narrative or is it an anti-master narrative? Does this play in general speak for the dominant group in the culture in which this play exists? Not just the people in the play, not just the story of the younger family, right? But the play itself. This play was produced originally in 1959 on Broadway. Okay? Now, who is the dominant culture on Broadway? Well, certainly Broadway in New York City, one of the main centers of the drama world, is not dominated by African Americans, is it? Okay? So you look at the overall context for this particular play. It might be about African Americans, and in some way it might be an anti-master narrative, but it also belongs in that larger culture. So you're looking at the play, you're looking at it in that larger context, and then we ask the questions about the play, those what questions. Who has the power? Okay? Who makes the decisions in the culture that's represented by the play? All right? Who has the power? Who makes the decisions? Who controls the money? Who decides how the resources are distributed? How are they distributed? Right? How are the social groups structured, and so on? This is a very, very, very big question in the play, isn't it? It's actually a question that the play deals with, because the youngers don't have a lot of money, right? The money that they get, the windfall, the $10,000, and by the way, in the 1950s in which this play is set, $10,000 would have been, you're going to find this hard to believe, folks, but $10,000 would have been a good, solid, middle-class annual salary for somebody, say, who worked, white-collar worker in a corporation or something like that. Okay, $10,000 would have been a good annual salary. So this is insurance. The insurance company controls the money, right? And the money goes to the youngers because they own this life insurance policy on their father, right? Or on Lena's husband, and so on. Who distributes the resources? Look at the housing question. All right? Housing. The younger family, they want to move. Okay? Who decides? What are the attitudes toward property? All right, I'll leave that one up to you because, again, property, housing, very, very important question in this play. What are the attitudes toward property? What are the younger's attitudes in particular? What are their attitudes toward property? Do they think that owning your own home is a good thing? Is that something that they want? Well, it certainly seems to be, right? Okay? How is property viewed? How is it distributed? Who has it? Big question here, okay? This gets back to the whole question of the social groups, all right? Who has property? Who has money? Who has power? Why do they have it? And the big picture of life. Okay, now I'm going to get back to this in a minute, but I want to make sure that you are clear about these questions here, because this is what I'm going to be asking you to do in the unit. Let me see if I put that question. Oh, yes, I did. This is our question for discussion in this unit on Raisin in the Sun. What is the master narrative behind the play? I'm asking you to deal with this in discussion. And in what ways does the play support that narrative? And in what ways does it argue against it? Okay. Now, let me just look at some of these things to give you an idea of how you might tackle this question. Certainly things like money, property, the ownership of houses in particular, are things that are valued by, okay, we certainly see that the African American group represented here values these things, but they are certainly values of the larger culture as well. That's extremely important. All right, do you see what I'm getting at? The younger family buy into the master narrative to a certain extent. Consider that as you're thinking about this question. Does the play support the master narrative? Well, you need to look at ways, in answering that question, you need to look at the ways in which the younger family actually share the values of the master class, if you will. Okay, I'm going to ask you to define who you think the master class is in the culture in which this play belongs, all right? But consider that. To what extent does the younger family share the values, the goals, the dreams, and so on of the master class? And if they do, then to what extent is this play perhaps supporting that? But at the same time, in what ways is the play arguing against the master narrative? Well, look at this whole question again of social groups. And by social groups, okay, we're talking about ethnic groups. We're talking about groups in terms of, well, the way social groups are normally organized, right? They're organized according to where people live. They're organized according to background. They're organized according to education. They're organized according to profession. They're organized certainly according to race. We're looking at all of these things, okay? Benethia wants to become a doctor, okay? So what social group is being represented there? And again, what values are being represented there? So as African Americans then, not just the youngers, but the group that this play seems to be speaking for is going against the master narrative, if you will, because they are trying to, in a sense, reorganize the social groupings. They are trying to move out of the area where they live. They're trying to move into a white neighborhood. Okay? They are trying to then achieve a certain kind of status that they have not had previously. Look at this question. as you deal with this whole general question about the play and the master narrative. The master's view of what is good. And I'm very, very tempted to go into detail about this, but I want you to consider it. And consider it in terms of what Walter and Benethia, Benethia, sorry about that, Benethia. Okay, Walt, okay, the son and the daughter. Okay. Consider it in terms of what they want. What do they dream about? Dream of for themselves. Okay? You want to, this is the big question here. To what extent do they share the master narrative's view of what is good? Okay? In answering that question, you need to look at what they want, what they dream of for themselves, Walter and Benethia. Okay? And then you have to ask yourself, finally, all right, in whatever your answer is, okay, about whether they share the master's view of what is good, you have to ask yourself, okay, are they buying into the master narrative then, or are they not? Okay? So let me just write that down here. Give you a moment to take note of it. We'll take the entire Younger family, all right? Lena and Ruth and so on, not just Walter and Benethia, okay? But are the Youngers supporting the master narrative or challenging it? Okay? And in answering that, you have to answer all of these other questions. Questions about the play's view on power, decision-making, distribution of resources, especially, okay? That big one. The organization of social groups, the structure of social groups, the attitude toward property, okay? Who has property, who doesn't, who has money, who doesn't, and so on. You're going to be answering those questions in order to be able to answer this larger question. Do the Youngers support the master narrative, or do they challenge it, or is it some of both? All right. And then finally, what about the play? Now, I said the Youngers. These are people in the play. What about the play itself? Does the play agree with the Youngers? Okay? All right, that's all I'm going to say about the master narrative. Thanks for listening. I hope that you will find discussion of this question interesting and rewarding. I think it's a great question, and I think it's a good way to get us into this very important play. And by the way, in case you didn't notice that picture that accompanies this lecture, all right, I hope you did notice it. That's Ruby Dee and Sidney Poitier in the movie version, first movie version of Raisin in the Sun. And a little piece of American history and also African-American history here. Sidney Poitier was the first black person to be awarded the Oscar for Best Actor. Okay, all for now, folks. I will see you online.